I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy for the gracious invitation. It's really nice to see you all. I'm going to be racing through a lot of the slides. It will not be very pedagogical because I want to communicate the large spectrum of work that we've been doing over the last 5 years. So you'll have a chance to look at it when the film comes out. But first, I want to say that I'd worked in the Netherlands as a scientist back in '86, and at that time I was doing the theoretical physics of magnetic solitons. Well, I've gone back to the future, learned my lesson, and now I think it's more important to study human mortality. So that's my story of going back to the future. That's the title of the talk. Two of my collaborators are here in the room with us. Marine and Jeremy are with us. And this is the kind of the front research page of Correlation Research, where we have highlighted all the various big research reports that we have put out. And so far, we have put out 26 rather large, detailed research reports since the year 2020, early 2020, where I first wrote a paper in June 2020 saying there is no pandemic. That peak is due to the reaction because the pandemic was announced. Please understand there is no pandemic, and so on. I put it in very direct terms at the time. So today I'll be talking about these things. I'll try to give a large overview. I'll look at history through the lens of mortality, Netherlands data, the methods that we use to extract excess mortality, and we'll look at globally, country to country, geotemporal variations that demonstrate that there was no viral spread. An empirical demonstration of that fact, and social economic factors, COVID measures, vaccine rollouts, booster rollouts, how we can determine that there were institutional assaults against the elderly, definitely. And so that's the plan for today. So let's start with the historical overview. It is well known that there are large cycles in history for such a long time where the elite and the people who control the economy, who can manipulate it to their advantage, they cause prices to rise dramatically and resources to be diminished. So you have extreme poverty that grows, and then there's a catastrophe. So the actual plague, the Black Death, was such a catastrophe, and it's well known now. These scientists, De Witt and Wood, have demonstrated that the people who died during the plague and who were buried, if you study their skeletons, they suffered dramatically from malnutrition, all kinds of deficiencies, and so on. So these are the people who died during the plague, and that is typical of these so-called pandemics. This has brought me to propose what I call the law of excess mortality, which is the elite class. Economic predation by the elite class gives you extreme poverty for many people, which gives you chronic malnutrition, deficiencies, toxic food, toxic environment, and so on. And those are the conditions that are ripe for large events of excess mortality by different means. So that is the kind of the concept that I've been working with here. And that is certainly true of the United States during the COVID period. Here we show that in the first years of the COVID period, if you take the total excess mortality, it is directly proportional to poverty on a state-by-state basis. We demonstrated this in 22, I think the article was, and this is quite stunning. And it means that in a state, if you had zero poverty, you would have had no excess mortality. You can interpret it that way if you like. And so the same thing is definitely happening right now in our day, in Africa, for example, where there is massive excess mortality, a really big problem. And these researchers here, there's various articles that are coming out that are demonstrating the degree to which that excess mortality, which is completely inhuman and abnormal, is due to economic predation, systemic, structured economic predation. So there's no doubt about that. So on the big scale of things, this is what's happening. And if you look at the United States since 1900, and if you look at mortality of men and women, you can really see various things like the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, World War II, the Vietnam War, and so on, mostly men dying here. And if you look at France, mortality by month, you get these sharp peaks because people die more in the winter, in the northern hemisphere winter. And so you get, since the Second World War, the peaks can be very high in the winter, and they come down like that. And that last peak here is the big sort of first wave of, so-called first wave of COVID. And if you take that data for France and you integrate it by year, and you do cycle years from summer to summer in order to capture the winter, and then you normalize by population, you get this graph here for France. So you can see that in winters that were very murderous, in a sense, there's less mortality the following winter and so on. That's a well-known phenomenon. And here you see that because of the baby boom effect, mortality is increasing recently, and this little thing at the end is the COVID period, excess mortality. So that should put things in perspective for everyone. So in all-cause mortality, you can detect many things, and these are all the kinds of things you can detect. You can detect terrorist attacks, aviation accidents, you name it, the seasons, the harsh winters, all the different causes of mortality where the mortality is large enough to be detected by national statistics, you will see it. And so it's a very powerful tool. And if we go to the Netherlands now, let's start with this statistic, which is infant mortality since 1900 all the way to present. And this is one of the best indicators of the state of a nation, if you like. It's this kind of data that allowed Emmanuel Todd to predict that the USSR would disintegrate, for example, when he studied this kind of data. So this should give us an idea that irrespective of the fact, irrespective of the fact that we had COVID, really, if you're comparing since 1900, things are dramatically different today than they were back then. Dramatically different. That's the scale that you have to use to understand these phenomena, I think. And so if we look at all-cause mortality per year now in the Netherlands, you can see that this is the zero down here. That's the total mortality as a function of time. Population is increasing, it's increasing. And this little increase here is the COVID period of recent times. If you look now at by-cause mortality in the Netherlands, you can see that if the cause is what they call other accidents, which includes forces of nature, then you can see the North Sea flood of 1953 here as a very large, that year, mortality. And during the COVID period, those kinds of accidents, the deaths from those decreased. Okay, you can see that. If you look at total accidents and you look and you compare 65-plus-year-olds, the more elderly, and the not so elderly, you can see car accidents. You can see more accidents during the COVID period for the elderly, but not younger adults. You can see the biggest airline crash in history here in 1977, and so on. So one conclusion might be that increased elderly care kills by accident, if you like. If you look by cause at seasonal respiratory condition deaths, then magically those deaths disappeared during the COVID. Whoop, what did I do? Oh, yes. Okay, hang on. Yes, they disappeared during the COVID period. So I'll be using a dashed vertical line to represent the date at which the COVID period was announced by the World Health Organization. And in this slide here, this line is the end of the official COVID period. And so those kinds of deaths disappeared. And they were replaced by, among other things, what they called COVID deaths, okay? Now we look at the vaccines and we remind ourselves that that cationic nanoparticles are not something that exist in nature naturally. So your body is not used to recognizing them, eliminating them. They're particularly dangerous. They're cytotoxic to cells. They attack cell walls. They get distributed everywhere because they're not eliminated. That's why they can be distributed to all vital organs with a lot of blood vessels and so on. So it's a very dangerous product, and the toxicity was extremely well known up until 2019, and then we just forgot that these things were extremely toxic. So if you now anticipate that there will be problems, you could look at by cause, here, diseases of the blood as a function of time in the Netherlands. When you start what is called transfusion medicine in the early in the early 80s, you get a lot of deaths from diseases of the blood. Then there was a big ombudsman report in the Netherlands, and that was stopped. Then just after 2020, when the vaccines were introduced, you start having an upshoot of these deaths. And it corresponds to a risk of 0.001% per injection, if you were to do the calculation. So the vaccines are as toxic as contaminated blood, basically. If you look at diseases of the urinary and reproductive system, you again get this rise, not in 2020, but when the vaccines come out. And so the risk is higher, a little higher here, 0.005%, comparable to what you would find in surveillance data such as VAERS. You can do all-cause mortality and look at, on the basis of the cause, anything related that might be a cancer. So what they call total neoplasm even includes leukemias, and you get a flat line. We cannot detect in national data, not just in the Netherlands, but everywhere that we've looked, and by age group, we do not detect what would be deaths due to so-called turbo cancer. So just remember that these things are hard to see. It's not a phenomenon that is visible in this kind of data. If we now if we now go to bi-week data, you can really see in the Netherlands a transition. This is since early on, 1970, I think. And so you can really see, you have the seasonal patterns, you have the announcement of the pandemic, and then you kind of see a rise here, even in the background, and these peaks are higher, and this particular first peak is very high. So there is a transition to a regime of higher mortality during the COVID period and during the COVID era. And this is seen if you integrate now by year and look at by age group. So this is, again, for the Netherlands, but every line of a different color here is for a given year, and you have these different age groups. Then you see that the years prior to COVID have lower mortality, and then in the COVID years, you have this higher mortality, and it's persistent, and it's for all these ages, starting at around 60, starting at around the age when you are institutionalized, then there is this net, clear regime change to higher mortality. This regime change is very visible in the USA, where you can just see it in the graph of the per month data here, or per week below. The USA had dramatic increase in mortality and had shocking phenomena like a middle of the summer peak here, which is unprecedented in known epidemiology. And the convention was that these things can't spread in the summer with humid air and so on. So there's a lot of new things happening here. This is for, where am I now? Did I move forward? Yes. Oh, yes. Okay, this is just to point out that you can see these special events of mortality. And we go to France to see it better because they have mortality data on a by-day basis, and they can do it down to the commune, down to the smallest geographical unit. So what they see, for example, in France, and even in this kind of national data, you can see 4 different airline crashes, 3 terrorist attacks, a shipwreck, a massive heat wave of 2003 is visible in France. And when you go to a specific age group, you see it even more. It turns out that this age group, 20 to 29, they're the ones that are mainly killed in terrorist attacks. And they're the only group that visibly shows this shipwreck that occurred here. So that's the kind of thing you can see. And in France, you can go straight into the département Val d'Oise, where the Concorde crashed. And you can see on that day, all these deaths, over 100 deaths due to the Concorde crash in 2000. This is the 2003 heat wave in that same Val d'Oise region. And that's the COVID, the very first COVID peak there, which is blown up here. And that's the heat wave. But on the one day, you have the accident. So that's typical of the kinds of things you can get. Here's how the method works. What we do is, this is for the United States. In blue, I have the all-cause mortality by week. In orange is the theoretical historic trend that we calculate by a method that we've developed, where you take, on average, what was happening into, let's say, the 5 years prior to COVID, and then you project that forward to see what would have happened if there had not been a COVID. And then the difference between those two curves is what we call the excess mortality, and it is calculated on a bi-week basis. So that's how we produce the methods without getting into the details. It allows us to determine, for example, that the notion that 3.2 million deaths were saved by the vaccines in the US is complete nonsense. It would have had to require massive amounts of death that would occur just before the vaccine rollouts so you could be saved from them. I mean, it's just a ridiculous thing. So we wrote a paper just pointing out how silly that is. This is now, we're back to the Netherlands, and we're going to show a sequence. This is the mortality that we start with. Then we show you in dark blue here the theoretical trend line that we use to move into the COVID period. Then we show the excess mortality on a bi-week basis, and that same excess mortality can be put in terms of what we call a p-score. So what you do there is, for a given week, you divide the mortality, the excess mortality, by the theoretical trend line mortality that you would have had. So this is the percentage increase by week of the mortality compared to what the historic trend would have given. So it's a good way to express the excess mortality. And you can do that on a by age group basis. So this is for the 80-plus-year-olds. And with the 80-plus-year-olds, you see that you had these large peaks that are followed by negative values, large peak, negative value, and so on. So that is evidence that these large peaks are accelerated deaths of the elderly, and they would have died later in the coming weeks and months, but they don't. So compared to the historic trend, you go negative. So that's a demonstration of abuse and of something that's happening that is directly targeting these individuals. This is for the younger adults. This is for the even younger, the younger elderly. Now this is the younger adults. And so you can see that keeping the same vertical scale, it comes down, but it's still, there's a persistent excess mortality there. So for the Netherlands, you can do by year, by age group, but in the end, more than 100,000 excess deaths occurred in the Netherlands because of COVID up until approximately today. That's the number that we come up with for the Netherlands. This corresponds to 0.31% of the Netherlands population. Globally, in the COVID era, the number is 0.39%, so it's comparable. And this is the p-score for the three main age groups in the Netherlands as a function of year. And now we move on globally to see what happened globally on the planet. We had 125 countries with sufficient data, and so this is the kind of intensity map we see for the excess mortality, and we see a north to south gradient in North America as you go through towards poverty, coming down, and you see a large gradient of that type in Europe from west to east. It's very clear, even though there's some heterogeneity, there's a very clear gradient moving west to east as you enter the former Eastern Bloc and Russian countries with more health challenges throughout their lives and so on. This is how you analyze the data in this study of many countries. This is the case for Germany. And then we do what's called hierarchical cluster analysis to try and see, as a function of time, which countries are behaving similarly. And we find three major clusters that are distributed on the countries that we had data for in this way. And in green, that cluster, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Canada, and some others, are countries that have excessive, really exceptional, persistent mortality as you move into the later years. So globally, what we found was 31 million deaths. If you take that 0.39% on the basis of the population of the 125 countries projected globally, it would mean that there were 31 million excess deaths in the first 3 years of the declared pandemic. And so at the same time, there was vaccination. We saw a lot of associations in time between the vaccine rollouts and excess deaths, and we have calculated that that would correspond to an association of 17 million deaths. So 17 million of the 31 would be associated with the vaccines. Doesn't mean that the vaccines directly by their toxicity killed them. Not at all. In fact, we demonstrate that. Okay, so now we move on to the geotemporal analysis. Now we can go down to the county level in the United States and look at excess mortality, and we can go down to the what's called the NUTS3 level in Europe. And so we study that, and the next 6 slides are going to be me clicking quickly, and you're going to see a film, 6 slides long, and you're going to see by month the mortality evolving as they announce the pandemic to see what happens in Europe. So here we go. January 2020, nothing. February 2020, nothing. March, they announced the pandemic, and there you have the spikes in excess mortality in those places. And then in April, it's already coming down, but it's in the same places. And then by May, it's essentially over. June, there's some more mortality coming in, especially in the Eastern Bloc countries. And so that's what happened in Europe in those first months. And this is, if you integrate over those months, this is the kind of intensity map that you get for Europe. This is on a different geographic scale. And on the largest geographic scale, meaning by country, you get this. And so that yellow line represents the division between where there was mortality in the first many months of the declared pandemic and where there was essentially absolutely no mortality. So this virus refused to cross that border and apparently didn't have the visas or the passport or something. It refused to cross that border, and this is one of the big anomalies that demonstrates that this story is ridiculous. And in particular, we can demonstrate that there was continued travel, all kinds of economic exchanges, high levels between those borders, but there was no crossing of the mortality across like that. And you can see those kinds of anomalies when you look at specific countries as well. So in Italy, in northern Italy around Milan, there was massive initial mortality that you can see here. But in Rome, there was essentially nothing. Now, these two regions have very similar populations. They're both Italian, and they have the same amounts of poverty, the same big airports to the same areas all around the world. Everything's the same. There's a little difference of more air pollution in the north, but it is insignificant in terms of causing mortality. Yet there is this massive difference between the two. Why? Because in the northern states around Milan, they invited people into the hospitals to be treated emergency right away, very vigorously, because we're going to save you. In Rome, they suggested, well, maybe you could stay at home. And that's the difference. The same thing happened in the United States. On the East Coast near New York, there was massive spike of mortality. On the West Coast, same amount of poverty, same kinds of populations. They're both American. And there's airports, massive airports. In fact, there are more airport exchanges to Asia on the West Coast there. There was virtually no mortality on the West Coast at this time, at the same time that you had this spike. And that is contrary to the state-of-the-art theoretical calculations of where mortality should occur if you believe spread. So this is just one example of these theoretical calculations that were specifically done for COVID, including everything, you know, vaccine, mask, everything, whatever there was in terms of conditions, they included in their models, and they can never get the kinds of anomalies that we empirically measure. It just doesn't work, no matter what you do. So the conclusion to this section is, to put it bluntly, in that sense, there was no pandemic. There was no spread of a viral disease that caused mortality that we can detect using these methods. So in other words, there was geostatic variation, not geotemporal. So to explain it with my hands, geostatic is like this. The mortality comes up, comes down in the same place. Geotemporal would be up, down as you move across, you see? So you're spreading. There's none of that, none of it. So there was no pandemic in that sense. Now we look at socioeconomic factors. You can look at all the counties in the United States and plot what is essentially the P-score in that period as a function of any factor that you like. And so one that we like to use is % who speak English less than well, which correlates very strongly with poverty and racial features and so on. So it's a good proxy for poverty. And what we find is there are two branches in this cluster plot, this one and this one. So this branch are the states where there was aggressive hospital action to save people, and this branch is where there was a lot of poverty nonetheless, but none of this institutional behavior, and so you don't get that big proportionality, okay? You can also look at another factor, which is inter-county per capita income disparity, which is something we calculated. And what we find is that there are these incredible outliers. So basically, it was very dangerous if you were poor living near rich people, because rich people will build hospitals for you, and they feel compelled to help you, and they will really get in there. And so the strongest example of that was the Bronx, which had a tremendous death rate because of these public hospitals that were just bringing people in and treating them. And the same kind of thing was happening in inner city London, UK. So those are the kinds of things we discover. Now we can look at did people change their habits in terms of where they would like to die, in a sense, just before COVID and then during COVID. So people preferred to stay at home. They basically didn't die. And if they instead changed their habits, went into the hospitals and care homes, they died a lot more. So there's various graphs to show that. In the Netherlands, you have a north-south gradient that's quite evident. And these two provinces, regions, states are the ones you have to worry about. Something was going on there. I'll leave it up to the Dutch to figure that out. Similar thing was happening in Canada. Quebec had the biggest peak of mortality, massive, massive peak. Okay, well, here's now looking at the province of Quebec, and the only place where there was a massive peak was in Montreal in its big care homes and hospitals. So the pandemic in the whole province was limited to that. So this shows by province in Canada the percent of hospitals that are considered large hospitals, and on the same graph you have the excess mortality, and Quebec has the largest of both, you see, and they match quite well. This is the same kind of graph now for Canada by province, west to east, where you show GDP all sectors compared to all-cause mortality, and there's a very strong correlation. And I think we've come to interpret that there are two reasons for that. One is wealthy economies can build hospitals, and the second one is that these big GDP economies have a lot of young working people that lose their job when you lock down the economy. And that was devastating, and we showed that in the data. We looked at more than 80 socioeconomic parameters for Canada, and we used various statistical methods to study them. We found all kinds of correlations even between the factors. I'll just show you one. Opioid deaths compared to GDP real estate. Another example of living near rich people is a dangerous thing, okay? Okay, here's another one. Flu shots and mental health. If you're very sturdy mentally, you have good mental health, you're not going to get a flu shot, according to this very strong correlation, okay? We looked at all of these factors, and we made graphs like this. So these are Pearson correlation coefficients versus time by year and by sex for the given factor, which in this case is GDP all sectors. So here you see that it's the young males that have very strong correlations to this factor, the young males here. And we also looked at COVID measures, and this next graph is going to shock you. Here in Canada, or there in Canada, I guess, whenever you dramatically increase protection of the elderly, so here, here, and here, you immediately give rise to a large peak in excess mortality. So the more you try, the more you officially have tried to protect the elderly, the more you kill them. Okay, so that focused protection thing generally does not work if you're doing it this way. If you compare now excess mortality to vaccination policy, how many boosters, how many to which ages you're giving, if you have an index to demonstrate that, you cannot see a benefit from the vaccines. That's at best, you cannot see a benefit. If you suddenly lock down the society, and in particular old institutions that have elderly people living in them, you get a huge peak in mortality, similar to when you first locked down the society when the pandemic was announced. So there's a very strong correlation there. If Canada was giving financial assistance to people because they were closing the economy down, so every time they would significantly cut that financial assistance, there was an upsurge in mortality. That's very clear. And it was very obvious in a province like Alberta, where you have a very strong energy economy, lots of young working adults. So there were two major times when they cut the assistance, and it gave rise to big peaks of mortality that we could not understand any other way. There was no other obvious correlation. Now let's look at the vaccine rollouts and mortality. So this is all-cause mortality in black versus vaccine rollouts in blue for Argentina. And I'm just going to show you a bunch of countries so you can get a sense of the degree to which there is an association. So Argentina, Australia. Australia had a booster rollout there that is associated with a sharp peak. You can see that. It's one of the things that really sent us in that direction. This is Brazil, Malaysia, Paraguay, Philippines, Singapore, South Africa. South Africa had major excess mortality events prior to the rollout of the vaccines, and then others as you rolled out the vaccines. Suriname. So a lot of countries like Suriname and so on will have no excess mortality until you start these military-style rollouts of vaccines. Thailand, Uruguay, and now we're on to boosters. So with the boosters, the most stunning example, one of the most stunning examples we found was in Australia. Australia had no excess mortality until you started rolling out the vaccines, but especially when you rolled out the first booster here, you had this sharp peak in mortality in the middle of their summer, which is a place where this should never happen according to spreading viruses, okay? So that was a real shocker for us, and that's one of the reasons we studied the Southern Hemisphere first, because there were these peaks in their summers. That's what it looks like on a blow-up, and this was the case in every state of Australia. And the same kind of thing happened in Chile for the second booster. You can see in the purple color there. And in Peru, the first and second boosters were both followed by peaks in mortality. Now, Peru is near the equator, so there's no seasonal variation in the mortality, followed by huge effects during the COVID period, military-style interventions of the government, locking people into their homes, going around, making sure they've been tested and all this kind of thing. And then when the boosters came out, there were again more excess mortality. Institutional assaults I want to talk about now, and I'll just give one slide, one example based on the Netherlands. Here is excess mortality of the 80-plus-year-olds in the Netherlands compared to vaccine rollouts at the top slide, compared to testing rollouts in the bottom slide. So this is not positive test results. This is just number of tests, irrespective of the result. So when they decided to test, you can see here that you test a lot, you get a mortality peak. You test a lot, you get a mortality peak. And that happens quite often. This large peak with the black dot is another example that is difficult to understand in terms of vaccine rollout, in terms of the numbers anyway, but there was a huge rollout in testing just that preceded it. So this is the kind of data that gives us the idea, since we know about the degree of toxicity of the vaccines and so on, that gives us the idea that rollouts of tests and vaccines are military-style interventions in institutions with fragile people. You completely disrupt their care, you isolate them, you prevent their movement, you confine them, you mask them, you stress them out, and you intervene in a military style. And we believe that that is a major cause of death during the COVID period. So, in conclusion, from all these empirical data that we've gathered and analyzed, we have some constraints. If you want to try to say what caused mortality, you have to accept this empirical data. So, for example, there was no excess mortality until the World Health Organization decided to announce a pandemic. And then all of a sudden, in synchronicity, there were these peaks. So that's one empirical data you have to be concerned about. There was no spread of a viral disease, and so on. So there are all these constraints that we were able to establish, and that is the limit of what you can believe as a model to explain these big features. And so the model, the final model that we come up with, our best surviving hypothesis is this one. So this is a synthesis slide, if you like. So basically, the COVID period was a large-scale coordinated societal assault associated with all these types of aggression in brown there. The science is very clear that that will give you sustained biological stress, including psychological stress. I have to end it now, okay? And so given that stress, there's going to be induced all kinds of manifestations of various diseases, especially respiratory and so on. And so that's how people died. And so we 5 minutes, okay. And so we did, I did the review of transmissionless pneumonia. It's a very real thing scientifically, and more we're understanding the microbiomes in the body, especially in the breathing apparatus, and we're seeing that you don't need to transmit to get pneumonia. You just need to cause conditions in such a way that the individual, based on what's already in their microbiome, will develop pneumonia and potentially die. So this is our model of what's happening, and the reason that it's persistent is because that the things that have been done have been established institutionally. We're now more daring in how we protect our elderly. We're more daring in what we can do to them, how we can isolate them, confine them, and that has become institutionalized, and that is what is maintaining this strong, persistent mortality as we move away from the COVID period per se. So that's our explanation of what's going on, and it is consistent with a lot of areas of knowledge in science, with evolution, what kills you, what doesn't, all these kinds of things. So our model is consistent with these big pictures. And so what really happened during COVID? It was a planned coordinated assault. It was devastating. The attack on individuals were individually and together causing intense biological stress, which in turn causes disease manifestations, mostly respiratory at the beginning. And the said stress also caused increased addiction, which we clearly see in young adults that lost their work and their meaning in society and so on. And the resulting conditions were institutionalized, which is why they're persisting today in some countries where that is the case. And so in conclusion, I'll conclude the same way that we concluded in a 2024 paper, which is nothing special would have occurred in terms of mortality had a pandemic not been declared and had the declaration not been acted upon. And the solution, in my view, is the following one: dismantle geoeconomic and investor predation. That is a structural problem in countries and on the globe. Dismantle the elite systemic corruption that drives that geoeconomic investor predation, and push for at least some movement towards democracy, transparency, accountability. In other words, flatten the dominance hierarchy pyramid to the extent that you can. So without getting into the tactics, this is what the strategy has to be. And like I used to tell my students who would come to complain about their grades, I would tell them, stop only wanting to be oppressed fairly. In other words, tell me what you want the course to be. Tell me how you want to run things. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.